For 400 years, Solomon's temple stood as the most sacred building on earth, a place so holy that ordinary people weren't even allowed to walk inside. The innermost room was so sacred that only one man once a year could enter it, and tradition says that he tied a rope around his ankle, just in case he died in there and someone needed to drag his body out. The Ark of the Covenant was kept inside. Gold covered every surface. The air was thick with incense, a heavy blend of frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, and cassia that you could smell from outside the walls. It took 180,000 workers 7 years to build, and at its dedication, something happened that stopped the ceremony cold. A cloud filled the entire temple so thick that the priests couldn't even stand up to do their jobs. Not fog, not smoke, something heavier, something that pressed against your chest and made your legs give out. Solomon had built God a house, and God showed up. So here's the question nobody asks. How do you go from that to Babylonian soldiers smashing through the walls, looting everything, and burning the whole thing to the ground? The standard answer you hear in church is simple. Israel sinned. God punished them. End of story. But that answer skips over about 400 years of the most dramatic, tragic, and frankly unbelievable sequence of events in the ancient world. Kings assassinated by their own sons, prophets thrown into pits, secret alliances with Egypt that backfired catastrophically, and a God who, according to the text, tried everything to avoid destroying his own house. This isn't just a story about a building getting demolished. This is the story of how an entire civilization talked itself into its own destruction, one terrible decision at a time. To understand why the destruction of this temple was such a catastrophe, you need to understand what Israel looked like when things were good, because things were really good. Solomon inherited his father David's kingdom around 970 BC. David had united the 12 tribes of Israel, conquered Jerusalem, and turned a loose collection of semi-nomadic groups into an actual nation. But David was a warrior king. He fought for every inch. Solomon got to be the guy who enjoyed the results. And enjoy them he did. The Bible says Solomon received 666 talents of gold per year. To put that in modern terms, that's roughly 25 tons of gold annually. At today's prices, we're talking about something like $1.5 billion a year in gold income alone. This doesn't count the trade routes, the taxes, the tribute from vassal states. He built a fleet of trading ships that sailed to a place called Ophir, which historians still argue about. Some say it was in modern-day Yemen, others point to India or even East Africa. Wherever it was, the ships came back loaded with gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Yeah, peacocks. The king of Israel was importing peacocks. You could walk through Solomon's Jerusalem and hear animals from 3 different continents, smell spices that had never existed in this part of the world before, and see fabrics dyed in colors that most Israelites didn't even have words for. Foreign leaders came to see it for themselves. The Queen of Sheba traveled over 1,400 miles to test Solomon with riddles and see if the stories were true. According to the text, when she saw the food on his table, the seating arrangements of his officials, the way his servants were dressed, and the burnt offerings at the temple, she was, quote, breathless. The sheer scale of it overwhelmed her. But all of this was just the backdrop for the main event. Solomon's temple wasn't just a place of worship, it was meant to be the physical dwelling place of God on earth, the spot where heaven and earth overlapped, and Solomon built it to match that idea. He sent word to King Hiram of Tyre in modern-day Lebanon for the finest cedar wood in the ancient world. If you've ever smelled fresh-cut cedar, you know the scent. Sweet, warm, almost intoxicating. Now imagine an entire building lined with it, floor to ceiling, the wood still releasing that resin smell years after it was carved. 30,000 Israelites worked in shifts cutting timber in Lebanon, another 80,000 cut stone in the quarries, 70,000 carried materials. The stones were pre-cut so precisely that the Bible specifically notes that no hammer, chisel, or iron tool was heard at the temple site during construction. Think about that. tens of thousands of workers, and the only sounds on the Temple Mount were the scraping of stone against stone and the soft thud of cedar beams being fitted into place. They assembled this massive structure in near silence. The interior was covered entirely in gold, not gold-colored, not gold-plated, pure gold, hammered onto every wall, every beam, every fixture. When the lampstands were lit, the light didn't just reflect, it multiplied. Every surface caught the flame and threw it somewhere else. The whole interior glowed like the inside of a furnace, warm and golden and almost alive. The inner sanctuary, called the Holy of Holies, housed two enormous cherubim carved from olive wood and overlaid in gold. Their wings spanned the entire width of the room, about 30 feet, tip to tip. And when it was finished, Solomon gathered all of Israel for the dedication. The smell of roasting sacrifices filled the entire city. 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep slaughtered over 14 days. The smoke hung so thick over Jerusalem that travelers approaching from miles away could see the haze above the hills. The priests carried the Ark of the Covenant inside. And then something happened that nobody expected. A cloud filled the temple, not fog, not incense smoke. The text calls it the glory of the Lord. It was so overwhelming that the priests physically could not continue their duties. They stumbled out. The ceremony stopped. People who were there would have felt the temperature change, the air grow dense, a weight settling on their shoulders and chest like standing in the pressure before a thunderstorm. Except it didn't break. It just stayed. Solomon stood before the entire nation and gave a prayer that's recorded word for word in 1 Kings chapter 8. He acknowledged something remarkable. He said, "Essentially, I know that the heavens can't contain you, how much less this house I've built." But he asked God to let his name dwell there, to hear the prayers offered toward this place, and according to the text, God responded, not through a prophet, not through a dream. Fire came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifices. The heat must have been staggering. The people fell on their faces, not just out of reverence, but because the raw force of what was happening in front of them pushed them down. This was the peak. This was the moment when everything was aligned. The kingdom was wealthy, united, and powerful. God's presence was physically, visibly there. It should have lasted forever. But within one generation, everything started to fall apart. And the man who started the collapse was the same man who built the temple. Here's the twist that nobody sees coming if they only know the Sunday school version. Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, the man who built God's house, the man who spoke directly with God twice. Solomon is the one who broke it. The Bible says he married 700 wives and had 300 concubines. These weren't all love matches. Most were political alliances, marriages to daughters of foreign kings to secure trade routes and prevent wars. Standard practice in the ancient world, but there was a catch. His foreign wives brought their gods with them, and over time, Solomon didn't just tolerate their worship, he participated. He built altars to Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians. He built a high place for Chemosh, the god of Moab, and one for Molech, the god of the Ammonites, whose worship involved child sacrifice. The smell of burning flesh drifting up from the valley of Hinnom, just south of Jerusalem, would have been unmistakable. A sour, acrid, sickening odor that hung in the air for hours and settled into your clothes. The man who built God's temple. Built temples to gods whose worship required burning children alive, right on the hills surrounding Jerusalem, in full view of the temple. According to the text, God appeared to Solomon a third time. But this time, it wasn't a blessing, it was a warning. The kingdom would be torn away from his descendants. Not all of it. 10 tribes would be given to someone else. Only 1 tribe would remain for David's sake, and God named the man who would take them, a man named Jeroboam. But that tearing apart didn't come through invasion. It came through something much more human, arrogance. Solomon died around 930 BC. His son Rehoboam took the throne and immediately made the worst political decision in Israelite history. The people came to him and said, essentially, your father worked us to death with his building projects and his taxes. Lighten the load and we'll serve you. Rehoboam's older advisors told him to listen. Be kind to these people and they'll follow you forever. But Rehoboam went to his young friends instead. And their advice: tell the people that if Solomon's rule was heavy, yours will be heavier. Tell them, and this is pretty close to the actual quote, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. 10 of the 12 tribes walked out. They crowned Jeroboam king of the northern kingdom, which kept the name Israel. Rehoboam was left with just Judah and tiny Benjamin in the south. The temple was in Judah. And for the next 350 years, these two kingdoms would fight, scheme, and drag each other down. But the temple still stood. And what happened next in the north was a preview of something far worse coming for the south. Jeroboam, the new northern king, had a problem. If his people kept traveling south to worship at Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, eventually their loyalty would shift back to the southern kingdom. So he made his own worship centers. 2 golden calves, set up at Dan in the north and Bethel in the south. He told the people, it's too far for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel. That decision set the tone for the entire northern kingdom. Every king that followed Jeroboam either continued his idol worship or made it worse. Not one king of the northern kingdom was described as good by the biblical writers. Not a single one out of 19 kings over 200 years. God sent prophets screaming at them the entire time. Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel and won. He drenched his altar with water, 12 jars full, until the water ran down and filled the trench. And then fire fell from heaven, not a spark, not a slow burn. A blast of heat so intense that it consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the soil, and evaporated the water in the trench. You could feel the heat on your face from 100 yards away. The people fell on their faces and shouted that the Lord was God. But within days, the northern kingdom went right back to business as usual. Elijah was so devastated he sat under a tree in the desert and asked God to let him die. In 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire conquered the northern kingdom. The 10 tribes were scattered across the empire and effectively disappeared from history. Gone. The so-called lost tribes of Israel. The southern kingdom of Judah watched this happen. They saw their relatives to the north get destroyed. They had the temple, the prophets, and a front row seat to what happens when you abandon everything you were built on. You'd think they would have learned. They didn't. And what the south did was actually worse, because they couldn't claim ignorance. King Hezekiah came to power around 715 BC and actually did the right thing. He smashed the idols, tore down the high places, and led a massive national return to temple worship. The Bible says there was no one like him among all the kings of Judah before him or after. When the Assyrian army, the same force that had wiped out the northern kingdom, came for Jerusalem with 185,000 soldiers, the ground shook under the weight of their siege equipment. You could hear the rumble of chariots and the shouting of officers from inside the city walls. Hezekiah prayed, and according to the text, an angel killed the entire Assyrian army overnight. When the people of Jerusalem woke up the next morning and looked over the walls, they saw 185,000 corpses. The silence where there had been the noise of an army the night before would have been deafening. The Assyrians just left. Jerusalem survived. The temple survived. It was a second chance. But then Hezekiah's son Manasseh took the throne. And Manasseh didn't just go back to idolatry. He went further than any king before him. Manasseh ruled for 55 years, the longest reign of any Judean king. And in that time, he systematically dismantled everything his father had restored. He rebuilt the high places his father had destroyed. He put pagan altars inside the temple courtyards, inside. The sacred space that was supposed to house only the presence of God, where you were supposed to smell only cedar and incense, now reeked of burning animal fat from pagan sacrifices and the heavy, cloying smoke of offerings to Baal and Asherah. He practiced sorcery. He consulted mediums and spiritists. Jewish tradition says he had the prophet Isaiah sawn in half inside a hollow log. Whether or not that specific detail is historical, the text says Manasseh shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from end to end. And then there's the worst part. He made his own sons pass through the fire. Child sacrifice. The king of Judah, the heir of David, the guardian of Solomon's temple, sacrificed children to Molech in the valley of Hinnom, just south of Jerusalem. That valley, Gehinnom, is where we get the word Gehenna, the word Jesus later used for hell. And in Manasseh's time, it earned the name. The screams from that valley at night, the smoke, the smell. It turned the southern slope of Jerusalem into something that the people themselves began to associate with the worst place imaginable. The text says something devastating about this period. God spoke through his prophets and said that because of what Manasseh had done, he was going to bring such disaster on Jerusalem that the ears of everyone who heard about it would tingle. He said he would wipe Jerusalem as a man wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down. That image. Wiping a dish and turning it upside down. That's not just destruction, that's erasure. And the clock was now ticking. But God gave them one more chance, one more. Josiah became king at 8 years old after his father Amon was assassinated by his own servants. And somehow, despite being raised in Manasseh's legacy of corruption, Josiah turned out to be righteous. At 26, he ordered repairs to the temple. The building had fallen into decay, water damage, crumbling plaster, pagan graffiti scratched into the stone. And during the renovations, the workers found something buried in the walls, a scroll, the book of the law, which scholars believe was the book of Deuteronomy or a large portion of it. It had been lost, literally misplaced somewhere in the temple during the decades of neglect and pagan corruption. When the scroll was read to Josiah, he tore his robes in grief, because the scroll contained the blessings for obedience and the curses for disobedience. And Josiah immediately realized that Judah had been living under the curse list for generations. He launched the most aggressive reform in Judah's history, smashed every idol, burned the Asherah pole that Manasseh had put in the temple, destroyed the altars in the valley of Hinnom so nobody could ever sacrifice children there again. He ground the pagan objects into dust and scattered it over graves. He even went north into what had been the territory of the 10 lost tribes and destroyed the altar at Bethel that Jeroboam had built 300 years earlier. Judah celebrated Passover for the first time in living memory. The smell of roasting lamb, the taste of bitter herbs and unleavened bread, the sound of families singing together for the first time in decades. The text says, no Passover like that had been observed since the days of the judges, hundreds of years earlier. But here's the gut punch. God sent a prophetess named Huldah with a message for Josiah. She told him that because he had humbled himself and wept, God would spare him. He would die in peace. But the disaster was still coming. It had been determined. Judah had passed the point of no return. Josiah's reforms were real, but they were too late. The damage of 55 years under Manasseh had gone too deep. The people had followed Josiah's laws, but their hearts hadn't changed. And God, according to the text, knew the difference. In 609 BC, Josiah rode out to intercept Pharaoh Necho II of Egypt at Megiddo. The plain of Megiddo was flat, wide, and exposed, the worst possible place for a smaller army to engage a larger one. Egypt was marching north to help the dying Assyrian Empire fight against the rising Babylonian Empire. Josiah tried to stop them. Nobody is entirely sure why. Whatever his reasoning, it was his last decision. An Egyptian archer shot him, and he bled out in his chariot. His servants carried his body back to Jerusalem. The whole city mourned. The prophet Jeremiah wrote a lament for him. Judah's last good king was dead, and the nation had 23 years left. What happened after Josiah's death is a political disaster that reads like a thriller. 4 kings in 23 years, each one worse than the last, each one ignoring the prophets who were practically begging them to surrender. The people crowned Josiah's son Jehoahaz. He lasted 3 months. Pharaoh Necho, fresh from the battle where Josiah had died, came through and removed him, put him in chains, took him to Egypt where he died. Necho installed Josiah's other son, Eliakim, on the throne and renamed him Jehoiakim, just to make a point about who was really in charge. Jehoiakim was a disaster. He taxed the people to pay tribute to Egypt. He lived in luxury while the nation bled. He built himself a new palace with cedar paneling and vermilion paint while his citizens starved. The prophet Jeremiah publicly declared that God was going to use Babylon to punish Judah, and Jehoiakim's response tells you everything you need to know about this man. Jeremiah dictated his prophecies to his secretary Baruch, who wrote them on a scroll. The scroll was read to King Jehoiakim in his winter palace. He was sitting by a fire. The room was warm, comfortable. As each section was read, Jehoiakim took a knife, cut off the piece that had just been read, and threw it into the fire, piece by piece, until the entire prophecy was burned. You could smell the parchment curling, the ink turning to ash. His officials begged him to stop. He didn't. He literally burned God's word to keep warm. Jeremiah just dictated the whole thing again and added more. By this time, Babylon had risen to become the dominant empire. Nebuchadnezzar defeated Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC and became the new superpower. He came to Jerusalem and Jehoiakim surrendered, paid tribute, and became a Babylonian vassal. But after 3 years, Jehoiakim decided to rebel, probably hoping Egypt would back him up. Egypt didn't. Jehoiakim died in 598 BC under mysterious circumstances. Some texts suggest he was killed and his body thrown outside the walls of Jerusalem, left in the heat to rot, unburied, which was exactly what Jeremiah had prophesied. Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiakim, inherited the throne and the rebellion. He lasted 3 months. Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem in 597 BC, and this time, he didn't just demand tribute, he took it. The Babylonians carried off the treasures of the temple, the gold that Solomon had dedicated, the sacred vessels that had held incense and wine for nearly 400 years. They also took the king, the queen mother, the officials, the warriors, and all the skilled craftsmen. About 10,000 people in total marched out of the city gates and east toward Babylon. A long, dusty column of people who kept looking back over their shoulders at the temple, still standing on the hill behind them, getting smaller with every step. Among the captives was a young priest named Ezekiel, who would become one of the most important prophets in the entire Bible. Also among them, almost certainly, was a teenager named Daniel. But Nebuchadnezzar didn't destroy the temple, not yet. He installed Jehoiakim's uncle, Mattaniah, as a puppet king and renamed him Zedekiah. One more king, one more chance to avoid total catastrophe. Zedekiah is one of the most tragic figures in the Bible. He wasn't evil in the way Manasseh was. He was weak, the kind of leader who knows what's right, but can't bring himself to do it, because he's afraid of what people will think. Jeremiah told him repeatedly and specifically to surrender to Babylon. God's message through Jeremiah was blunt: serve the king of Babylon and live, resist, and the city will be burned with fire. Zedekiah actually met with Jeremiah in secret multiple times, in dark corridors of the palace where no one could see them. He whispered his questions because he was afraid his own officials would find out he was listening to the prophet. Jeremiah even told Zedekiah what would happen to him personally if he didn't surrender. He would be captured, brought before Nebuchadnezzar face to face, and taken to Babylon. If he surrendered peacefully, the city would survive. But Zedekiah's officials were pushing for rebellion. They had secret meetings with Egyptian envoys. They told the king that Babylon could be beaten. And Zedekiah, who knew better, listened to them instead. He rebelled against Babylon in 589 BC, and that decision killed everyone. Nebuchadnezzar didn't send a delegation, he sent an army. In January of 588 BC, the Babylonian military surrounded Jerusalem and began a siege that would last 18 months. 18 months. Think about what that means for a walled city. No food coming in, no trade, no fresh water beyond what the springs and cisterns could provide. Within weeks, the markets were empty. Within months, people were eating things that would have made them vomit a year earlier. Donkey heads sold for silver. Dove dung became food. The Book of Lamentations, written about this period, describes conditions that are almost unbearable to read. Mothers who had been compassionate cooked their own children for food. Children begged for bread, and no one gave them any. People's skin turned black and clung to their bones. The city that once smelled of cedar and incense now reeked of death, sewage, and desperation. During the siege, Jeremiah was still prophesying, still telling anyone who would listen that God had determined this, that fighting was useless, that surrender was the only option for survival. And for this, Zedekiah's officials accused Jeremiah of treason. They said he was demoralizing the soldiers. They convinced the king to let them deal with him. They threw Jeremiah into a cistern, not a prison cell, a muddy pit with no water, only wet clay at the bottom. He sank into the mud up to his armpits, cold, dark, airless. They left him there to suffocate and die slowly. A foreign official named Ebed-Melech, an Ethiopian serving in the palace, went to the king and said that the prophet would die of starvation in the pit. Zedekiah, in one of his few moments of decency, ordered Jeremiah pulled out. They lowered rags and old clothes on ropes so the ropes wouldn't cut into Jeremiah's skin as they hauled him up through the mud. But Zedekiah still didn't listen to him. At one point during the siege, the Egyptian army actually marched north and the Babylonians temporarily withdrew to deal with them. Hope swept through Jerusalem. People celebrated in the streets. Zedekiah's officials said, "See, we told you. Egypt saved us. Babylon is gone." Jeremiah sent a message to the king. "Don't deceive yourselves. The Babylonians will come back. Even if you defeated their entire army and only wounded men were left in their tents, those wounded men would get up and burn this city down. That's how determined this outcome is." The Babylonians came back, and this time they were angry. On the 9th of Tammuz, 586 BC, they breached the walls. The sound of stone crumbling, battering rams pounding, soldiers screaming as they poured through the gap. After 18 months of silence from the other side of the wall, suddenly the city was full of the sounds of war. When the walls fell, Zedekiah did the one thing Jeremiah had begged him not to do for years. He ran. In the middle of the night, the king and his soldiers escaped through a gate near the royal garden between the two walls and fled toward the Jordan Valley. The Babylonian army chased them and caught them on the plains of Jericho, out in the open with nowhere to hide. Zedekiah's army scattered. His soldiers abandoned him. They brought him to Nebuchadnezzar at his headquarters in Riblah in modern-day Syria. And what happened next is one of the most haunting passages in the Bible. Nebuchadnezzar killed Zedekiah's sons in front of him. Then he put out Zedekiah's eyes. The last thing the last king of Judah ever saw was the murder of his own children. Then they bound him in bronze shackles and took him to Babylon, where he died in prison. Remember what Jeremiah had prophesied, that Zedekiah would be brought before Nebuchadnezzar face to face and taken to Babylon. And remember what Ezekiel prophesying from Babylon had said, that Zedekiah would go to Babylon but never see it. Both prophecies came true. He met Nebuchadnezzar face to face. He was taken to Babylon, but he never saw it because he was blind. A month after the walls fell, Nebuchadnezzar sent his captain of the guard, Nebuzaradan, back to Jerusalem with specific orders. He burned the temple. The cedar wood that had taken 7 years to cut and carve went up like kindling. The gold on the walls melted and ran in streams down the stone. The fire was so intense you could see the glow from miles away, a sick orange light on the horizon that people in surrounding villages would have watched in silence, knowing exactly what it meant. The air for miles around would have tasted like ash and molten metal. He burned the royal palace. He burned every significant building in the city. His soldiers tore down the walls of Jerusalem. They took every piece of bronze, gold, and silver from the temple. The bronze pillars named Jachin and Boaz that had stood at the temple entrance for nearly 400 years were broken into pieces and carried to Babylon. The bronze sea that sat on 12 bronze oxen was dismantled. The pots, the shovels, the wick trimmers, the dishes, the incense pans, all of it gone. The remaining population was deported. Only the poorest people in the land were left behind to work the vineyards and fields. Everything Solomon had built, everything David had dreamed of, everything that had taken generations to create, destroyed in a matter of weeks. And the Ark of the Covenant? Nobody knows. It's never mentioned again in the biblical text. The room where God's presence had settled, where the air itself felt electric and the temperature changed, that room was empty. Scorched walls, collapsed beams, and nothing inside. To this day, no one knows where it went. So why did it really happen? Because the easy answer, that God was angry and punished them, misses the point entirely. When you read the full story, all 400 years of it, what you see isn't a God looking for an excuse to destroy. You see a God who tried everything to avoid it. Prophets were sent for generations. Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Micah, Jeremiah, Huldah, Ezekiel, and dozens of others, each one with the same basic message. Come back, change course, there's still time. Miracles were performed, fire from heaven on Carmel. An entire Assyrian army wiped out overnight, supernatural signs that should have made the choice obvious. And for brief moments, they did. But the reforms never lasted. Hezekiah's son undid everything. Josiah's reforms died with him. The pattern was always the same: crisis, repentance, reform, complacency, corruption, crisis. Jeremiah gives us what might be the most revealing insight into why. He records God saying, "I spoke to you, rising up early and speaking, but you did not hear. I sent my servants the prophets, rising up early and sending them, but you did not listen." Rising up early. It's an image of urgency, of someone who can't sleep because they're worried about someone they love. Not a vengeful deity waiting to smash things, but a God who got up before dawn, over and over, to warn people who refused to listen. The real reason the temple was destroyed wasn't one sin or one king or one bad decision. It was a 400-year pattern of knowing what was right and choosing what was easy instead, of having the prophets and ignoring them, of seeing the northern kingdom destroyed and thinking, well, that won't happen to us, of being given reformers like Hezekiah and Josiah and letting their work evaporate the moment they were gone. It was the slow, steady erosion of a people who had everything, who knew the truth, who had seen the presence of God with their own eyes, felt it press against their chests, smelled the incense in the courts, heard the fire fall, and who decided, generation after generation, that it wasn't enough. The Babylonians were just the instrument. The destruction started from the inside, long before a single soldier crossed the border. Here's what's easy to miss. The story doesn't actually end with the fire. 70 years after the destruction, a group of exiles returned from Babylon and built a second temple on the same spot. It wasn't as grand. The old men who remembered Solomon's temple, who remembered the golden glow of the interior and the weight of the incense in the air, wept when they saw the new one. But they built it anyway. And the prophets had promised something else, that one day the glory of the latter house would surpass the glory of the former. That wasn't just architecture. According to Christian and Messianic interpretation, that prophecy pointed to someone who would walk through those very courts 500 years later. But that's another story. And if you want to see it, the video about what happened when Jesus walked into that second temple is on screen right now. Subscribe if you want to see the Bible like you've never seen it before. We're rebuilding every major biblical event with AI so you can see, hear, and feel what these stories actually looked like. I'll see you in the next one.